what was central to Jadunath Sarkar was his view that the writing of history is an intensely personal experience between the historian and the evidence which he has gathered. That there should be nothing coming in between these two basic forces, the historian and the evidence. So he said it doesn't matter whether my history somebody likes or dislikes, whether it is good for the country or not, whether it shows my country in a good light or a poor light, all of that is immaterial. My job as a historian is to interpret the facts which I have and present them as faithfully as I can. So essentially, what he accepted was the fact that in history writing, you will never have one view. You will have the view of one historian. There will be as many views as there are people writing those histories.
Thank you very much for attending this session. Normally, history is not very fashionable. Historians have become historians have become more fashionable than history in various ways. Raghavan is one of those unique people who, after retirement from a very active and a very accomplished life in diplomacy, went back to his, probably I would say, his second love. I leave the question of what was his first love unanswered. To his second love, which is history, and has been producing book after book of rather interesting and extremely readable histories. I was struck when the compere just now mentioned the fact that the Indian History Congress had awarded him the Muhammad Habib Prize for, I don't know which, was it for this book? Now, that's very interesting. Muhammad Habib is one of those characters, very interesting early historians. He was the father of Irfan Habib, incidentally, just as a footnote on that. He wrote this rather slim volume on Mahmud of Ghazni, which is what he's really quite famous for. Otherwise, editing a series of documents which were later brought out as History of India as told by its own historians. Now, the point about Muhammad Habib was that in explaining Mahmud of Ghazni, he suggested that there was no religious dimension in the destruction of Somnath and other things. That this man was what might loosely be called a person who pursued Marx's theory about the primitive accumulation of capital. So, a banditry was the main motivation of Mahmud of Ghazni rather than any form of religious fervor. Now, it's interesting in that context, but Muhammad Habib is considered someone in whose name a prize is awarded by the Indian History Congress. But one of the people who is probably one of the pioneers, but not someone who actually was very fond of the Indian History Congress, is a person called Sir Jadunath Sarkar. In 1997, I was given the task of editing a volume which India Today brought out, which was called the 50 Indians of this century, because of the 50th year after independence it was. And there was a team of people who were asked to nominate people, etc., vet them. So one of the names I insisted on putting there was the name of Sir Jadunath Sarkar. And the biggest objection to that name, ironically, came from fellow historians who said that this is not a man whose interpretation of Mughal India bears scrutiny. And it is on Jadunath Sarkar, Sardesai, and Raghuveer Singh, the three people who played such an important role in documenting the history of the later Mughals. When I say the later Mughals, I mean Aurangzeb plus, and the Marathas. And Raghavan has told us a story about the process in which this whole exercise of recreating history, getting the documents together for the historians, for future generations, was actually managed. So let me start off, Raghavan, by allowing you to say what was really in your mind when you wrote, and you're not the only, and you were there have been two successive accounts of Sir Jadunath Sarkar which have been written. The one by Raghavan and an earlier one by a very accomplished historian in Chicago called Dipesh Chakravarti. Now, the interesting thing about Dipesh Chakravarti's book, which is also very interesting, is that when it was written, it was greeted with sullen silence from the rest of the historians. As if, what has Dipesh done? Here was a man who was the great icon of the subaltern school. And here he is celebrating someone like Jadunath Sarkar, the sort of high priest of reactionary history. And so, given that, what are your views on Jadunath Sarkar and how has this book been greeted?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. And it's a great pleasure and a great honor to share the stage with Shwapan Das Gupta, someone I've known for a very long time, someone who has educated me with his writings for many, many years. And I think we first met in London in the mid-1990s. So thank you very much for inviting me for this festival. And thank you also for discussing this book about Jadunath Sarkar, G.S. Sardesai, and Raghuveer Singh. You see, Jadunath Sarkar wrote most of his books a century ago. He's known for his great works on the decline of the Mughal Empire. He wrote a 5-volume history of Aurangzeb, the last volume of which came out in 1923. He wrote a 4-volume history of the decline of the Mughals, which came out between 1929 and 1933. So almost a century has passed. The interesting thing is his books remain in print even now. And for a historian to remain in print 100 years later is saying something. And the reason for that is not so much because of the politics around him or his views, but because he wrote history for a general audience. He wrote with a great deal of dramatic force so that people enjoyed reading his history books, and he would animate the stories or the histories he was telling. So there is a certain quality to his history writing which rises above the politics of history writing of the past 70, 80 years. Now, what was central to Jadunath Sarkar, and this is, I think, the most important thing to remember, because there are all kinds of views about Jadunath Sarkar, there are all kinds of views about the Mughals. What was central to Jadunath Sarkar was his view that the writing of history is an intensely personal experience between the historian and the evidence which he has gathered. That there should be nothing coming in between these two basic forces, the historian and the evidence. So he said it doesn't matter whether my history somebody likes or dislikes, whether it is good for the country or not, whether it shows my country in a good light or a poor light, all of that is immaterial. My job as a historian is to interpret the facts which I have and present them as faithfully as I can. So essentially what he accepted was the fact that in history writing you will never have one view. You will have the view of one historian. You will not have a view of everyone agreeing on what happened in the past. There'll be as many views as there are people writing those histories. So I think that is something which we ought to remember when we talk about Jadunath Sarkar. And the second thing, of course, is that he felt that because it is such a personal experience and because it is essentially a process by which a historian interprets the data which he has, there is no scope in it for social or national or factors to come in, or for nationalism or chauvinism to play a role. So, in that sense, he stands out as an objective historian. Now, Swapan is quite right. There was a period from the 1950s till the 1980s or 90s when this kind of view was was regarded with a fair amount of suspicion, because it was felt that history must have a larger purpose, that history should try to consolidate communities, it should try to unite different communities, and we shouldn't go into those aspects of our history which would be divisive in the present context. Now, Jadunath Sarkar would have disagreed immensely with that view. He said, good or bad, I have to tell the history as it is. So, which is why he wrote about Aurangzeb at a time when the communal situation in the country was quite supercharged. You know, in the second decade of the 20th century, the Khilafat movement was at a Khilafat sentiment had become quite prominent. But he wrote about Aurangzeb, and when you read Sarkar's account of Aurangzeb, you understand that Sarkar deeply admired Aurangzeb. There were many qualities of Aurangzeb which Sarkar deeply admired. But at the same time, he said that I cannot be blind to other facets of Aurangzeb's rule. And similarly, when he wrote about the decline of the Mughals, Sarkar by no means is celebrating the decline of the Mughals. He sees it as a great tragedy which has befallen the country. Because what he sees in the decline of the Mughals is a national decline. Because along with the decline of the Mughals, he sees a simultaneous decline of the Marathas, a decline of the Sikhs, and in fact, a decline of all national forces against imperialism coming in from outside. So, it would be mistaken to see Sarkar in a parochial sense. We have to see Sarkar as someone who felt that objective history writing, as the historian defines it, is really the role of the historian. That is the duty of the historian. And of course, views about history, history is written to be superseded. Every generation will rewrite history. There was never going to be a standard narrative which is going to be accepted for all times. So I would say, yes, Sarkar is important, that despite his views have been superseded, a new kind of histories have been written. But because he was such a great writer, such a great, someone who wrote with such dramatic force, his books remain in print. And it's something which we should all try to aspire to.
I think, let me point out for your comments, two facets of Jadunath Sarkar's writings. The first is his rigid, almost fanatical adherence to documents. I think this has a certain salutary lesson for people who write history these days, because there is a tendency to not go to the archives any longer. And I'm using archives as a sort of euphemism for actually going to the primary sources, learning the language. And Sarkar was absolutely fanatical. You cannot study Mughal history unless you know the language in which the documents were written. Or the same with the case with Maratha history, which is what explains his sort of collaboration with Sardesai and others. So that's the first one. I want you to comment on that. And the second issue is that when you said that he wrote history for the ordinary reader, the importance which historians those days attached to prose, it's something which probably got inherited from Gibbon and to some extent. But the importance of prose in the writing of history, and why has it been so severely discounted. Uh, it reminded me of what the late Professor Dharma Kumar once told me about a historian. And he said, "Oh, he's an interesting man. Pity he doesn't have a vocabulary of more than 200."
You're quite right. Sarkar, and along with Sarkar, G.S. Sardesai and Raghubir Singh, they had an almost obsessive desire to accumulate new facts. That means you try to find manuscripts, you try to find new sources, and you try to unearth new facts so that it enriches the history which you are writing. They were almost obsessive about given the passion they put into collecting these documents. And many of his he was not an easy man to get along with, and he made many enemies down the way. And while one can say that there was a certain political change which explained why he was somehow regarded as being a somewhat disreputable historian, it also had a great deal to do with his personal animosities. I mean, he fought with everyone. One of his great fights, and this was talked about a great deal in the 1920s and 1930s, was 1920s was with the then Vice Chancellor of Calcutta University, Ashutosh Mukherjee, and thereafter he continued that fight with Ashutosh Mukherjee's son, Shama Prasad Mukherjee, and similarly he picked up quarrels all everywhere, and much of it had to do with was with the fact that he had very, very strong views. He had very strong views on the writing of history. He had very strong views on the teaching of history. So let me answer your second question first, that why did he write with such clarity? Because he worked hard at being someone who could write clearly so that the ordinary person on the street would understand what he's saying. And he was a very accomplished teacher and a greatly revered teacher. One of the tasks he set himself as a teacher was, how do I teach my students to write a sentence which is absolutely legible? And he wrote somewhere that if at the end of a third year BA, I can teach my students to write one paragraph which is clear, concise, and makes sense, I think I've achieved what I set out to do. So I think writing with clarity meant a lot of work. You had to polish your prose. You had to train yourself to think with clarity, because unless you think clearly, you won't write clearly. And certainly, I think that art of writing with clarity is something which has been discounted, because if you have tests based on objective type and nobody's being taught to write a sentence or a paragraph, how will they ever learn how to write with clarity? So it's a discounted art, but it remains nevertheless a highly prized commodity.
Uh, of course, Jadunath Sarkar also wrote, incidentally, which people may not know, he also wrote in Bangla. So there's a lot of his writings in Bangla which have been now brought together in collected works, which are also of something significance. Another facet of the writings of Jadunath Sarkar and historians whom he influenced was the importance they attached to charitra. To them, it was the rise and fall of empires was often dictated by the strength of personality of those who were at the helm. And he often, and this would be a completely unfashionable view now when we look at other objective circumstances, etc. But how would you look at something like charitra, which he attached so much of importance to?
Well, he saw character as central. I mean, to put it simply, he saw the decline of the Mughals because he felt that the character of the emperors who followed Aurangzeb was somehow lacking. That they didn't have the dedication, the discipline, the courage which previous emperors and especially Aurangzeb had had, and because of this decline in character, the Mughal empire crumpled. And he has a similar thesis to a great extent about the Marathas, that somehow the later Marathas after Shivaji were not the men which Shivaji was. Was when so Now subsequent generations of historians have questioned this excessive emphasis on character, because they say, as you said, there are numerous other factors, and it's not as if the character of Aurangzeb or the character of Shah Jahan, if you compare it clinically, compares that much more, is that much better than the later Mughals, because in many ways they all had pretty dissipated kind of lives. So it had the strength of the empire derived from economic, social, political factors, and because of a change in circumstances, all those factors came under grave threat from other influences, and the empire started crumbling. So people have felt that Sarkar was obsessive, or Sarkar was gave far too much emphasis on a single factor alone, which is the character of the rulers, when in fact there was a whole structure which was weakening at different levels, and it was simplistic to only identify character as the reason why the empire crumpled. But I think for us, the takeaway is that to understand the Mughals, for instance, or the Marathas, I think unless we look at the personalities of the people who were concerned, you get a partial kind of view. History becomes very dry if you're reading only about the economic factors or the social factors or the larger institutional and political factors. You need to understand history in terms of the people who were actually the protagonists of it. And while one can say that it would be wrong to give too much emphasis to a person's character, but to animate history, to make it interesting for people, you do have to bring in personalities and personal likes and dislikes and personal inclinations and disinclination.
Well, now that you mentioned the dryness of history, would you say it would be a fair comment that the appeal of history in India to a larger audience has shrunk quite exponentially or quite dramatically, courtesy the massacre of the subject by historians?
I think academic history, the problem became that you had academics writing for other academics, and there was a publishing industry which was very small but which could sustain that kind of ecosystem, and therefore the larger public, the interested public, somehow felt excluded from these very densely written books, which were full of theoretical arguments and discussions and long digressions. So they felt that somehow this is not animating animating history the way it should, and the public then abandoned good history writing and went into what was actually not history writing but was more mythology and
Quasi history.
quasi history. So I think that was certainly one big problem, it's a big problem which continues today. To some extent, it is being corrected, but I would say that we still confront the problem. Now, you can see a contrast with this if you look at, for instance, the United States. In the United States, you have very, very dense, academic, highly theoretical, very difficult, not accessible at all history being written, but you also have a huge amount of history which is being written for an interested public. The best history in the world today, incidentally, is written by the United States about themselves. I mean, the best subject, if you want to read a good history book, read about the US Civil War. There'll be hundreds of great books on the US Civil War. And, one can say it's not related to us, but it's good history writing. And in the end, a good history book is a good history book regardless of the time and space it is being written about. Similarly, in Britain, you have a tradition of academic historians writing for the general public also. I think in India, the problem for too long was you had academics writing for other academics. And while there is a certain space which should always exist for academic history, because in the end, it is the historian in the university which sets the standards. No amount of people writing for a general audience, people writing well researched but still general history books. They cannot make up for the academic historian. There is no way we can ever be, someone like me can ever be a substitute for a university teacher of history, because he's teaching the subject year after year, and then when he writes, he's writing on the basis of a certain accumulated experience of long years of researching and thinking about that particular subject. So I think the space for academic history has to be preserved and protected. But there is an argument for making it more accessible. Either the historians themselves make the effort or other people do it for them, which is where public history or people who are interpreting or rewriting academic history to make it more accessible for the general public. But that by no means should mean a comment on the importance of academic historians themselves, because as I said, they set the standards. They are the guardians of the flame. In the end, they are the ones who are going to say whether a particular approach is right or wrong. And it's very important that they do that.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned it, is because, in the old days, the history syllabus of Delhi University, before the term post-colonialism became fanciful and fashionable, they used to have this paper in the very first year on British history. Now, you might say, what the hell is British history got to do with it? But I think two things. One is it exposed the student who just come out of school at that particular point to probably some of the best historical writings you could get. Absolutely the best. Secondly, that accumulated knowledge of British history was invaluable when it came to studying the history of British rule in India. And today you often find people who are commenting or writing things about the Indian situation in the 19th or 20th, early part of the 20th century, without any sense of the linkages that existed with Britain. And that, to my mind, is a very shortcut thing. So sometimes academic historians, I don't know how much you'll agree with this, have helped narrow the field in the guise of trying to be too correct.
Perhaps, but it is bound to happen, because academic history, if I understood you correctly, is based on specialization. And specialization will mean a certain narrowing of fields, which will mean looking at, spending more and more time looking at less and less. But I think we cannot, it is something which is inevitable, which has happened all over the world, which continues to happen all over the world. And it's something which has to be protected, as I said. I think academic history writing, no matter how dense and inaccessible it may be, has a role, because in the end, that is the gold standard. And while it may not be accessible, while it may have numerous other deficiencies and difficulties, but that particular role is very important for all serious writing of history. Because without it, we won't have a standard by which you can measure yourself to. In the end, all history writing is basically an exercise in, how you frame the questions and what are the questions you are asking. So, in that sense, the academic space is very important.
One of the facets of someone like Jadunath Sarkar was which you alluded to earlier, was the fights which he continuously had with fellow historians. And one of the big fights which he had was with people in Allahabad on the question of the nationalism of Shivaji. And his suggestion was that it was wrong to bring a sense of nationalism which was absolutely contemporary and transpose it into the life or the activities of the Marathas at that particular point. Do you find that, and he had similar sort of disagreements with people in the Indian History Congress, but that was more in the nature of turf wars. Do you find that historians are inclined to sometimes prioritize the contemporary political exigencies and put them onto the past?
Well, they are. And it's, in the end, every generation will write history again. You will never have an uh, absolute and final version of the past. So the present always intrudes in writing about the past. That is inevitable, and historians are conscious of it. They try to exclude that influence, but it remains, and it is for other people to criticize it and to comment about it and to bring it out. There is no way you can have a closure on this debate, which is why they say that before you read a particular book on a certain history, you have to ask who is the historian and what is the standpoint from which he is writing. But to turn to Sarkar, you see, Sarkar's legendary controversies were not on the were not on the Hindu-Muslim issue in medieval history. It was about what he wrote about Shivaji, because he contested the view that Shivaji was in some ways a kind of an effort to create to build to establish a Hindu kingdom in medieval India. And he deeply contested the view of many Maratha historians at the time that Shivaji was trying to build a Hindu Padpadshahi. That means a Hindu state. And he scoffed at people like Savarkar and others. He said that these people are not historians. They don't know what they're talking about, because Shivaji had no such idea. He was trying to construct another state in opposition to the Mughals, because the Mughals were not giving him the space he wanted. And many of his difficulties with his own very close friend G.S. Sardesai was over this, because they had widely different views about Shivaji. But which is where the third person in my book, Raghubir Singh, he was a Maharaja of a small state in Madhya Pradesh, and what is now Madhya Pradesh becomes so important, because Raghubir Singh had a different view of the Marathas. Raghubir Singh, for someone in Malwa, his was a Rajput kingdom in Malwa. They saw the Marathas as foreign elements, because they had been propped up by the Mughals, they had been established by the Mughals. And Raghubir Singh's point was that the Marathas are totally alien to and are a foreign element in this part of Malwa. Now, you can agree or disagree with each of these views. The point is to understand that historians need space to express whatever view they want, because in the end, what they are doing is a personal experience of interpreting the evidence which they have unearthed.
Yes, I think Jadunath Sarkar was approached by Dr. Rajendra Prasad and told to write the official history of the freedom movement. And he said, I cannot write a history based on the diktat of the government. And a small as a sort of footnote to that, when in 1947, he was asked, do you think India is ready for independence? And his answer was, yes, but in 1997.
The other reason why Jadunath Sarkar, fell into some disrepute post-independence was not because of this, but because he was seen as a totally pro-British. He was an Anglophile many times over. So that was the other reason why.
That was more Bengali than Anglophile, isn't it?
But, I want to mention one more historian who was a great, in a sense, a disciple of Jadunath Sarkar, which is R.C. Majumdar. Right. And R.C. Majumdar was also asked to write a history of the freedom movement. And then he accepted the task, but then soon resigned, because he felt, I can't write an official history. But if you read R.C. Majumdar's history of 1857 today, you will really wonder whether it would be allowed to be published in our present time, because the kind of approach he had to Rani Lakshmibai or many other people whom we revere as icons of the freedom struggle or the first freedom struggle, he said it was not a freedom struggle at all. It was a sepoy mutiny. Now, he may be wrong, and I think many people have said that yes, there are limitations in this view, but it really illustrates the point that the historian will have his own view on what he's going to write about the past.
Do you want to conclude by something about Sardesai, the other important historian which you talked about? His volumes on Maratha history are available in English for everybody. It's still available. And
Sardesai was not a trained historian. He was he used to work in Baroda in the service of the Gaikwad, but history was a kind of hobby and a passion, and he started writing about the Marathas with a great deal of passion and conviction, and then he became friends with Jadunath Sarkar. Jadunath Sarkar was a trained historian. He saw the merit of what Sardesai was doing, but felt constantly that his Maratha, his great pride in the achievements of the Marathas had to be restrained with a more clinical approach. So Sardesai wrote a 3-volume history of the Marathas, which is called A New History of the Marathas, and much of it, Sarkar would have disagreed greatly, because it's a view which extols as great liberators of the Maratha people, that their rulers were inspired by the highest of motives, and they set out to do something new. For Sarkar, this was all, this was sentimental and driven by a nationalism and a kind of regional parochialism. But nevertheless, Sardesai's books also remain in print. These issues about how you should write regional history, which he confronted in his time, are still valid today, because I think parochialism, when we write about our regional histories, is a factor which we have to confront. Because every region in India today, every state in India today is now rewriting its history without regard to the facts at all. Everyone feels that as long as you can show my ancestors in the best possible light, that will sell the book. You don't need to do anything else. I think there remembering Sarkar and Sardesai and Singh is important, because regardless of their views, there was a basic commitment to the empirical, the facts, the empirical basis on which you're writing. And I think that empirical basis to our past, we have to certainly keep it with us.
Just to tell you that probably the most complete archives of Indian rulers is to be found in Pune in the Peshwai Daftars, which were left more or less unscathed by the British conquest. And it's a tragedy that much more research on Maratha history hasn't been done so far. And there has been a big gap between the time Jadunath Sarkar, Sardesai, and others wrote, and now one or two historians, amateurs, who've actually done some good work, people like Uday Kulkarni and others who've done some work. So just to point out that history is not necessarily for the person who's got a PhD in the subject. History writing is for everybody. Enjoying history is for everybody. And I think Raghavan, in his approach, exemplifies that tradition of the lordly amateur who's actually quite a professional. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.